Hello and welcome to episode 85 of the PURE TOKYOSCOPE Podcast. I am Patrick Macias, the author of the new book, Mondo Tokyo.
No, I am Patrick Macias.
What?
No, just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, I'm Matt Alt, the author of Pure Invention, How Japan Made the Modern World. And today we have a very special guest, don't we, Patrick?
Ding dong, we open the door and it's our special guest. Look who's here, Matt.
Who are you, special guest?
I'm Patrick Macias. No.
What?
I'm Alex. Hi.
Hi, Alex. Why don't you give your last name and date of birth, also social security number?
I'm Alex Smith, often online as Alexander O. Smith, but that's entirely because there's way too many Alex Smiths out there, and I thought that was a good idea, like 20 years ago, to use my full name. But I go by Alex.
And you're known as this is like a Mad Libs thing.
No, wait, I know this because I found this Wikipedia page for you, and everything on the internet I see is true. It says you're a professional Japanese to English translator, and it has your education, your occupation, your preoccupations, your years active. It's got all this information. This is incredible.
Did you write this?
I have actually a funny story about that Wikipedia page.
Okay.
I did not write it. And in fact, the first time it was brought to my attention, I looked at it and I'm like, oh, actually some of this stuff is incorrect. And so I went in and tried to edit and I got shot down.
Oh, you got your own edits shot down?
Yeah, kind of shot down. They're like, unsubstantiated.
So, well, everything on Wikipedia is true, so it's all okay.
Now, you guys have known each other for a long time, longer than I have, but I didn't know this until today, and I feel like this is a major gap in my knowledge about you, is you were involved in the localization of Vanquish, one of my favorite video games of all time for Platinum Games in 2010.
I didn't know this until today too, or more specifically, I'd completely forgotten this.
Oh man, I love that game.
Yeah, tell us all about that game, Alex, since you remember it so well.
I have nothing but great memories about that game, Matt and Patrick, and I'm really happy you guys asked.
You are also known for doing, I think you did another video game. You did some in the Final Fantasy series. Are you the even-numbered Final Fantasy guy or the odd-numbered?
I'm technically even-numbered Final Fantasy guy.
Okay.
However, I also did work a little bit on Final Fantasy 9 and Final Fantasy 11 and whatever the hell.
Wait, you were on 11 too? What did you do on 11? We were translating like help files. What were you doing?
I was doing just world text and dialogue and stuff like that. Yeah, that was the last project I worked on as an in-house translator at Square.
Oh wow, okay, maybe that's how we got the job. I just remember that was like one of All Japan's first like big coups as a localization company. We had to string up all of this Ethernet cable in Hiroko's parents' house to get the because there was no Wi-Fi back then. It was like what 2001.
2001,
3,
2-ish, 2002.
Yeah. Anyway,
you applied for that while I was still there, so I think we might have been working on it at the same time. Which
yes,
would make
you guys and your silly test. Your silly test that was crammed full of things that trip translators up. How could I forget it? I wonder if they still use that at Square Enix.
I wrote that test. I hope they still use it.
I don't think half of it was like horoscopes. It didn't make any sense for a translator. It was, and also I remember lists, like huge lists of just like random item names in Japanese that I guess you guys were looking at like to see if people could come up with amusing romanizations for them.
Yeah, as I recall, the two big things we were trying to accomplish, let's say three things we were trying to accomplish with the test was there were a couple translation challenges in there to trip up people who didn't really understand Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
Like
me.
Boku densha kitayo, which
right.
delivered by the mom.
Yeah.
So the literal translation of that is hey, the train came, but the way that the words are being used, like boku is usually what little boys use to refer to themselves, but in some circumstances you can actually call a little boy boku if you're familiar with them, and thus it becomes a you in English. And densha kitayo means the train's coming, not necessarily the train is already here.
Right.
And so understanding those things, if you looked up in a dictionary, you'd be completely lost. But if you actually spoke Japanese, you would, it'd be very easy to understand. So there was that sort of base level tricky question. And then there were impossible requests like translate these room names, but we only gave you, say, 10 characters or 10 English letters to translate them. And that was not enough because that was something you had to do all the time.
Yeah, those character limits were really a bear early on. I recall Hiroko and I actually, we Kobayashi Maru'd this test because we forced Square to give it to us together instead of independently. So it was like an American and a Japanese working on it at the same time. I think we had like the highest score on there until Matt Trevo or somebody came along and beat it just by themselves because they're a linguistic god.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, anyway. But so Square Enix, you were there for a while. You did quite a few of the Final Fantasy games, and after that you went freelance, and I think you were working on some titles like, off the top of my head, and actually I think you were working in the room I'm sitting in right now, you did the Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney game first.
Yeah, actually, I mean, the first thing I did after leaving Square was to immediately start working on another Square project, as one does.
Of course.
But with way better access to, important people and, all the funny things that Dilbert pointed out a long time ago.
For the sake of all the Phoenix Wright fans out there, did you feel like the game was going to, have the potential to be a smash hit when you first saw it? Because Final Fantasy was already a thing. Phoenix Wright was new. Did it have the heat?
So this actually came through an agency. It may have been the last job that I did.
It was Bound Global, wasn't it?
It was Bound Global, although at that point they may have already been bought by Lionbridge.
Yeah, it was right around there. Well, I don't mean to inject myself into this, but it came to us first, and we were too busy, and then it went to you.
No kidding. I had no idea. Are you sure? You're talking about the first one, not like the fourth?
No, I'm talking about the first one for sure. And Hiroko and I were in the middle of working on Dragon Quest VIII, and I think at that time, and just didn't have any spare time. And I really wanted to do it, but then it went to you. And what happened? Tell us what happened.
So the sense that I got at the time, and this was confirmed later, was that this was a complete shot in the dark for Capcom. They had no idea how it would do, which is why they had an internal translation team, but clearly they were just farming it out to whomever. So they really didn't know what would happen. As soon as I saw it, I'm like, hey, this is a lot of fun. This is a great game. I hadn't played it before, I got the job, but when I did play it, I thought, hey, the writing's really sharp. The comedy's hilarious. It's a fun game to play. It's well built, and especially like that first issue, the first installment in the series, I think was it's a real gem of a game. So I thought it was great, but they really did not know what they had. In fact, I heard that they only printed, or I don't know if printing's the right word, but they only constructed a certain number of cartridges for it when they released the game, or packages for it when they released the game, and it actually sold out, and they had to go back for a reprint.
Was it a DS game? What was it? What was it
a
for?
DS game, yeah.
It was, because I think there was a Game Boy Advance version too, like even before that.
Yeah. And I'm digging myself a hole here. I do think that it was Game Boy Advance, the first one. I think the first DS one that I worked on was for Phoenix Wright 4.
Did you struggle a lot with translating the word objection in large red letters with an exclamation point?
The only struggle that I had was, Matt mentioned earlier that I probably worked on it on the room where he's sitting, which is because Matt is in my old house.
Yes, I am.
The Animal House?
It is the Animal. It is the Riot House, the localization Riot House. It's like a lot of localization went on in this building, that's for sure. Anyway, yes, you were working on it here, and
however, actually, no, that's slightly inaccurate. I was working on it in the Starbucks across the park.
Oh, okay.
I think I did that one almost entirely at that Starbucks. So the challenge to answer Patrick's question is, every time I saw objection, I had to shout objection at full volume in Starbucks. So,
Is the one you localized the one where it's obviously set in Japan, but they made you translate it like it's in America?
It was not. The first one was not obviously set in Japan.
Okay.
It felt more like a San Francisco kind of betwixt and between kind of vibe. There were obviously Japanese elements, but nothing like, screaming, this is set in Setagayaku in Tokyo or anything like that. And so we had to make a decision, however, about where it was, because there was a time zone clue in there in one of the investigations. So I don't remember if it was me or somebody in the team, but basically just said, okay, it's like LA or something.
Right.
And then that became completely ridiculous with the later editions of the game, where things became more and more Japanese to an insane extent, like way more Japanese than a game totally set in Japan would be. So yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Oops. Well, it's not like localizers have that much control. I know it's like it's now very hip to bash on localizers online these days because I think people think that they're the gatekeepers of all the lore and the information, and people don't realize that actually the localizers are just as bound by the dev team as anybody else is.
It's interesting that you use the word gate in reference to bashing on localizers.
Okay, local gate. What's it called? I don't even. Has it been gated yet? I don't
know. But there was some Gamergate sort of. I don't know what you'd call it after.
Well, it's exclusively on Twitter, so it's not like it's a real thing. Localization bashings. I don't know what you want to call it.
I actually got a tiny whiff of that way back in the day. I guess you'd call it like a heckle or something,
right?
Where somebody's like, "Oh, this guy's a revisionist localizer," and I was accused of I think the pronunciation is Macek-ism,
like Carl Macek.
Exactly. Which to me, that's kind of like a badge of honor as far as I'm concerned, because this was a guy in a really interesting kind of difficult situation where he had to sell a long series of shows in order to get on US network.
Macek, right, yes.
And in Macek, yeah. And the stuff that he was working with were all these really short series. And he's like, I'm going to cram 3 of them together and sell those as one show because it's all made by the same studio.
Resulting in the Robotech trilogy. That's just for those people who are just tuning in and have been living under a rock for the last 40 years.
And now Harmony Gold is the most powerful entertainment company in the world, aren't they?
I subscribe to Harmony Gold Plus on streaming. So.
Right, exactly. The Harmony Gold Plus network. We can only dream of such a thing existing.
But there's more to your resume here than just TV games, as the kids like to call them. There's some novels, there's some manga, and I think the reason why we sounded off the trumpet to bring you in to the Pure Tokyoscope Death Cult today to interview you is to talk about your work translating Dr. Slump by the late and the great Akira Toriyama.
I think all of us actually, you did that through Viz, didn't you, Alex?
That is correct.
So all of us here, what are we, Vizzies?
Vislings.
Vislings.
We used to call ourselves Vislings.
You, Patrick, were in-house, correct?
Yeah, I was in-house for about 7 or 8 years, and I've done freelancing for them on and off occasionally.
Yeah, and that same thing, All Japan, Hiroko and I have translated a bunch of titles for them, mainly Dorohedoro, I think. That's them, I think, on and off. And Alex, I think you did a lot for them, didn't you?
Yeah, back in the day. Dr. Slump was a big one. It wasn't the first one. I worked on this kind of cute little manga called Muhyo and Roji.
Do not know it. Wow. Okay.
Supernatural Investigation Bureau or something like that. And then Samurai Deeper Kyo, I want to say. Does that sound right?
Yeah. I remember that. I remember that just because you were talking about it.
Yeah, long time ago. Although I did actually do another Toriyama manga. Yeah, which was called Kowa. C-O-W-A.
Oh, you actually translated that. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was really cute. I like that one.
That's like one of his minor. Is that pre-slump or post?
Oh no, it's way post. It's
okay.
It's pretty modern, actually. In fact, it's post like Dragon Ball X. Or Dragon Ball Z. Jeez, and the podcast now.
That was a Masicatization of Dragon Ball.
That's right. I'm rewriting Dragon Ball and Dr. Slump to make it all one continuous, and I'm calling it Dragon Ball X.
But Dr. Slump, wow. I mean, I remember being incredibly jealous when I heard about this because I'd always wanted to translate Dr. Slump. That was like one of my favorite manga as a kid, not even being able to read it.
Yeah, and also if you want to describe the story, the manga, the premise for people who don't know.
So Doctors, actually, probably either of you could do a better job at this than I could, despite the fact that I translated the manga. But Dr. Slump is this groovy little story about a scientist, a mad scientist, who invents many things, but one of his first, at least in the story, and greatest inventions is a robotic sort of android girl named Arare, and mayhem ensues.
That's pretty much, and it's a massive, like, it's basically a parody of everything. Patrick, in our last podcast, we were talking about it, described it kind of as like a Japanese Mad magazine, which I thought was a really apt description of what is basically unfolding at any given moment in the story.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It has this sort of core story, which we can kind of get into later even, but there is this sort of core story and elements of, it's almost like a fatherhood story.
Right.
Because he's trying to raise this girl, in a sense, who's a robot that he's created. And there's all of that awkwardness and also like the heart too of a family drama.
Right.
And I think that's actually kind of the thing when I was rereading through these last week, actually, and the first time I've read through them since translating them, basically. And yeah, I was really struck by that. I think that's why people cared, really, was that relationship between Dr. Slump and Arare and that sort of whole cast of characters around them. And then you also, on top of that, add in like all of these crazy pop culture references.
Right.
It's like one of the sampling album, the great sampling albums from, the late 80s, early 90s.
Are you saying that Dr. Slump is the Paul's Boutique of manga?
If not the Fear of a Black Planet, or hey, 3 Feet High and Rising.
It does have that feel to it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Although I noticed that when I was rereading through, that's actually pretty light on the ground early on. It was only later in the series where he really leans into this, like there's Star Wars references on every page and just like everything. And Ultraman stuff all over the place. And so like it definitely felt like it was a bit of a tonal shift as he got into the characters and started feeling more comfortable with the kind of humor that he was doing.
Oh, it says here regarding the humor, according to Wikipedia, my only source of information for anything, is Dr. Slump is filled with puns and toilet humor and parodies of both Japanese and American culture.
Oh, Alex, you and your potty humor.
What is the quotient of what you would describe as nasty ass humor in relation to the puns in the pop culture?
Well, my scientific survey says, I'd say actually it's like 10%. Maybe 15%, but you remember it because where else did you see a smiling poop on a stick?
Exactly. That's his gift to the world,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And what a gift. Something that you said on an earlier podcast, actually, about how Toriyama would kind of get canceled now definitely holds true. And yet I was looking through, there's one, it's actually very early on where he has to go buy underpants for Arare because he realizes, he has no clothes for this robot that he's made. And so he's like, he dresses up as a woman and he's sneaking into the thing. And there's all this really risque humor. And it's probably not something that somebody would write now, but would WRITE now. But reading it in the sort of historical context of Dr. Slump, it's very like pure-hearted, and you don't get the sense that, like, I never felt icky reading it, if that makes sense.
For a second, they're going to say in the historical context of Bosom Buddies, the sitcom from the 80s.
Which is the only historical context any of us need, really.
Really, truly. So it's Wikipedia and Bosom Buddies. That's pretty much my entire, American history in a nutshell right there. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is the language in there, because as you know, like Dr. Slump became this huge societal phenomenon in Japan in the early 80s, to the point where like every kid in Japan was quoting Arare's unique turns of phrase and things like that. Like, what are there? There's ncha, and like when she runs, it's like what, king in katakana. And these things are seared into the memory of Japanese people of a certain age. Basically, anybody under the age of about 50 or over the age of 50. I don't know what I'm trying to say here. It's seared into a kind of generation. How did you handle stuff like that when you were translating it into English?
So because I'm a revisionist agitator, Masochism,
media assassin.
Oh, awesome. Bringing it back to a Fear of a Black Planet reference. My initial impulse, and in fact, what I did on Phoenix Wright, for better or for worse, was to, okay, here's the joke that the Japanese is trying to make. How do you make a funny here in English that follows along the same lines, but is not going to require a footnote or an explanation?
Right.
Because, classic example, they're making a joke about pickled plums that means nothing to your audience. Although, plot twist, now it kind of does mean something to the audience because we know a lot more about Japanese culture. And all of that stuff kind of goes into those decisions that you make when you're translating something. For Dr. Slump, first of all, when I was translating it, it had been out for decades at that point. So it felt like a historical document. And it was also very much being positioned by Viz as, you like Dragon Ball? This is where it all started.
Right.
And so the goal here was not so much, And just to be like clear, I'm actually, I don't actually think of myself as like a revisionist translator. I feel like when you're translating something, when you have an original work and you're making a work in English that's very closely based on that, the work that you're making in English needs to stand on its own as its own product. And what that means is based on, you know, where did the work that you're translating come from? What are the needs of the product at the time? I have absolutely nothing against, except for the massive illegality of it, like the scanlation style of translation,
right?
Where they tend to over-explain everything, because that's right for that audience.
Yeah, like you're talking about for the manga nerds who want every nuance or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. They haven't learned Japanese. They haven't learned Japanese yet, or they're on the way, and they're really interested in the culture, and they're really interested. They want to know the, you know, the nuts and bolts, and they'd rather get that than, you know, a funny joke that wasn't actually what was in the original. And that's totally cool. Like different products for different needs, I think. So with that in consideration, you've got Dr. Slump here, where it is sort of a historical document, and there is a lot of that history and that sort of the culture around it. Like, you know, every Japanese kid of a certain age knew kin and ncha and baicha and ohakonbanchiwa, and, you know, all those like the funny things that they say in Dr. Slump. So mostly we left those in.
You left ncha in?
Ncha is in, yeah. Yeah, she says ncha. And the first instance of it, it has a little asterisk and there's a footnote and it says, this is Arare's greeting, you know, done.
You know, a joke that you have to explain. But what else would you have done, you know? Like if you had changed it, it would have to something funny in English. It just wouldn't have had any connection to the original. So I get that.
Yeah, exactly. You know, like haicha or whatever. I mean, it's not funny and it's not interesting and it's not Arare either. So you have to, you know, obviously you're making a decision, and looking back through it, I'm like, okay, kept kin, totally makes sense. Kept ncha, baicha, that baicha even makes more sense than ncha, of course, but did not keep ohakonbanchiwa, which becomes something a little later on. And for everyone listening, ohakonbanchiwa is kind of a portmanteau of ohayo gozaimasu, which is good morning, and konnichiwa, which is hello or good day, and konbanwa, which is, you know, good night, good evening. And it's all mushed together into ohakonbanchiwa. That I actually translated as good mornooning, because
okay,
it didn't feel as essential to the character. First of all, it's nowhere near as iconic as like ncha and kin, and also it's one of those things where it's like I don't think people would be able to read it or like even parse it, because it's just such a word salad. So that's a consideration too.
No, it's interesting. That's actually a really good one. You should work at this. You should get a job localizing stuff.
I should be a translator.
While working on Dr. Slump, did you get a sense of the man behind the work, the creative genius of Akira Toriyama? Any insight into him as a creator? Just your own personal feelings?
Yeah, I'd say kind of in two ways. One is you just get that sense of the humor, and it's not just set up for a joke punchline. It's this constant background noise of funny that goes through the whole thing. And you can totally picture him sitting at his desk, just laughing his ass off, having the best time, coming up with increasingly stupid gags. And so I think it's hard to read this and not say, you know, I'd like to have a beer with him. You know, it's just, he seems like a really great guy and super funny, a little obsessed with the poop, but hey, you know, who isn't?
He always struck me as, you know, this isn't a really great comparison because one is like a really outgoing performer and the other one is, and Toriyama is absolutely more of a hermit, but he always struck me as kind of a weird owl, like Japan's Weird Owl. Mm-hmm. He's just constantly remixing stuff and putting it in there.
There might be a Hawaiian shirt or two in his closet. You know?
And the hair, he had that giant afro thing going on in the 80s, you know.
Yeah.
I've never actually seen them in the same place at the same time, Matt.
You know, the interesting thing is that Toriyama didn't come to manga like through the usual path of like being an obsessive manga person. I was just reading this interview with him from 1983 where he and Torishima are like kind of being co-interviewed together, and Torishima's like, you don't know anything about manga. You didn't even read Ashita no Joe. You didn't read, you know, Star of the Giants. You didn't read anything. And I think that actually serves him well in like being able to convey, like, you don't need to be a manga freak to understand his world, which I think is actually one of the big problems with a lot of the genre stuff you see today. You have to have kind of been steeped in Japanese pop culture to get it. But you don't really with Dr. Slump, do you? Even as a Westerner, you can kind of like, you know, swim along with it, don't you think?
Absolutely. It gives you all the info you need to follow along.
Well, you barely need language because the visuals are so crazy.
Yeah. And that's another other challenge, I think, with this manga in particular is a lot of the humor is so pervasive that even the sound effects have humor in it. Like there's crows flying in the background that say "baka baka." In Japanese, it's "baka," I mean idiot, basically. So, like, you can't even have a bird tweeting without it being a joke. This manga.
Are there any other like episodo, as the Japanese would say, if we're doing an interview there? Like any other interesting things that happen in the translation of this, or like
there were a number of sort of back and forth moments where nobody knew what to do about something. The biggest one actually was Arare's name itself. Because when you look at it in English, first of all, that's one of these things where, and it happens sometimes, where the name is obviously usually written in Japanese, but in the art of the manga, actually, Toriyama had written it out in English.
With an L instead of an R, right? It's around.
L instead of an R.
It's right there on her baseball hat, right?
Yes.
Exactly. And so when you're looking at it, it's a rail, basically. And
yeah,
ultimately, like, I think looking back at this, it would have been cool and maybe appropriate for this book to actually include some sort of cheat sheet at the beginning where you're like, this is how you pronounce Arare's name. This is this is this joke. This is this joke.
Right.
And actually, and I thought about this as I was working on it. I remember halfway through, I'm like, really what we should do is there should be like a director's edition version of this manga where you don't localize any of the jokes and you just like explain things out and it becomes a sort of Bible for people who really want to get into it. But that's also not economically feasible.
Well, you say there's actually precedent for that. I remember when Anime Ego, do you know? Anime Ego released Otaku no Video, and it was translated by Michael House, who I know you know, because we used to all hang out together during our college days. And Michael like produced this like essay, practically the liner notes for that thing were epic. Like he explained every like visual joke in every scene. It was crazy. It was a cheat sheet. I don't know like if that made the product sell more, if it was more popular, but it was really cool to have that. And I could totally see, there's like the annotated Dr. Slump, that would actually be really cool. Viz, are you listening? I'll hire the three of us to annotate Dr. Slump, please.
But that was then and this is now. And I guess about 2 or 3 weeks ago, we did lose Akira Toriyama. I'm curious if you had any kind of emotional reaction or what happened in your life, your feelings about this sort of thing. If your feed was also filled with images of football teams wearing Super Saiyan wigs.
Oh, yeah, it was an event. These things kind of catch you by surprise because it's not like I knew the man, but you really feel that loss when you start thinking about it. And of course, seeing everybody openly mourning on, social media and stuff. I'm glad, I'm really glad that he sort of became what he became and that his work was available all over the world. And I mean, Dr. Slump is a tiny, tiny part of that when you look at how much influence Dragon Ball had and the fans, especially outside of the English speaking world, they had access to that much earlier, I think, than Americans did. And yeah, just seeing that, I think it's great. I'm really glad that he made the splash that he made. It's really sad that he's not with us anymore.
You didn't go on to do any Dragon Ball, did you?
No, I was in talks with somebody about that, but I think I also had a conflict of interest, like one of the Final Fantasies or something.
You were searching for one of the Dragon Balls too, and so it wouldn't have been right for you to translate this?
You had to power up and do a new form or something like that?
The funny thing is that the beginning of Dragon Ball is a lot like Dr. Slump in the sense that it's kind of this wacky, madcap even adventure that's, loosely based on the Chinese Journey to the West myth/proto-novel. I'm not exactly sure what Journey to the West was.
And Arale-chan shows up at one point, doesn't she?
Yeah, well, she's actually, I think, hinted to be the strongest scion she can defeat any of the other characters in the Dragon Ball world. I think it's hinted at that, or maybe not even hinted. Maybe it's hammered over the head. But Dragon Ball doesn't really have any of those cultural references especially after it transitions from that Journey to the West adventure into kind of the I don't know, what do you call it? The Kamehameha power up, bad guy of the arc phase.
Pro wrestling
that it turned into. And I think that's why it got so big. It's kind of, unchained from Japaneseness in a big way, in a way that Dr. Slump, you basically had to have been there in Japan circa 1981 to really get it. Agree, disagree, objection?
Yeah, I totally agree.
So what are you working on now, if you can talk about that?
Yeah, I can't talk about specifics because game industry, NDAs and stuff, but about 6 years ago, I took a step away from translation and started doing writing full time. And I had been doing that before in bits and pieces. In fact, sort of wrote a mobile game for DNA like 7, 8 years ago now. But
what is that game?
It's called Blood Brothers 2.
Just as long as it doesn't have an exploitative title.
Anyway, about 6 years ago, I stepped away from translation, started doing writing full time, working with the people at Moon Studios on Ori and the Will of the Wisps and another game that was just announced, actually, which is No Rest for the Wicked. And then moved on to working for the fine folks at Camouflage, who are the makers of Iron Man VR. And so I've just been heading off in that direction. I expect that at some point I will wander back into translation at some point, just because I do really enjoy it.
This is an interesting question to end this with. Like, is there a path back into localization? Because all Japan has kind of gotten out of it too. It not only was at first, about 5 years back, the market got flooded by fresh college graduates who were willing to work for like basically nothing to get their foot in the door, which is, it's how the way of the world. But now like AI is rearing its steely head. Is that the word? And sometimes I wonder, is there even a market for a bespoke translation anymore? What do you think?
I think as long as there is a market for a bespoke anything that is created by a human, that there's definitely going to be a subset of the media that's being produced by Japan, since we're all in the Japanese English gig here, that people will care enough about to pay and collaborate. And that's actually a really important part of it, I think, is collaborating with another creator who can take it from the Japanese to the English and make something that's going to sing and fire on all cylinders in the English-speaking market. I feel like, or I have to believe that there will always be a small market for that.
Right.
As for localization in general, I mean, that's probably a topic for another podcast, but.
Yes. And probably, you were already moving into novels. Like I know you didn't you do a bunch of Project Ito stuff? Didn't you do All You Need Is Kill?
I worked on that with Joe Reeder, who is my longtime collaborator on these things.
And Tom Cruise, correct? You worked with Tom Cruise on that?
And Tom Cruise, also my longtime collaborator on these things.
Was jumping up on the couch and he's screaming about localization. But I wonder if novels are actually the way of the the way of the human, so to speak. Like the human touch will definitely be felt more in that kind of long form localization, more than the kind of commodity localization that video games often are.
That's possible. I'd like to think that there's going to be some boutique video games though that would really benefit. I mean, you look at stuff like even back in the day, like Katamari Damacy,
sure,
and games like that. Can you imagine like those? The time that AI can do what those translators did with Katamari Damacy is the time that like AI can do anything. And so we're having a completely different discussion at that point.
The Matrix discussion, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, like that to me is not even worth discussing because it's such a different world that, we'll deal with that when we get to it. But in the meantime, I feel like there is opportunities for indie games, and again, novels.
Indie manga.
Yeah, they need that human touch. People want that human touch. And the more that the Japanese creators can collaborate with localizers, translators, publishers to make that a connected process where you have a bunch of sort of like-minded creators pushing a product into its ideal state for a new language, then I think you're going to have some great stuff happen.
Okay, Masick.
Robotechnology, is AI the robotechnology that was promised to us by Carl Macek back in the day?
The protoculture could well be.
Oh man. Well, hey, thanks for coming on. I believe in touch. I think Patrick does too.
Oh, I sure do.
Thanks for coming on. We should do this again. We should totally do this again. We've done this before over beers. We've never done it over pixels. What is this? Carrier waves? We should do it again sometime.
Thanks to both of you for having me on. It's an honor. I enjoy your podcast. I think you guys are doing a great job. Congratulations to Patrick on your new book.
Oh, thanks so much.
Yeah, I'm super looking forward to reading it. I ordered it from some weird jungle website, or maybe it's a river. I'm not sure.
Oh, wait a second. Felix doesn't know about the whole chapter you wrote on him yet. Oh no.
I'm looking forward to Vanquish 2, Electric Boogaloo.
What about Blood Brothers 3?
What about Blood Brothers. Why aren't we talking more about Blood Brothers 3? That's what I want to know.
I want to talk about your socials. What are your socials? Tell us, where can we find you?
You can find me at the incredibly impossible to spell Aokajia, which is Aokajia. I'm that on pretty much every social platform, but I'd push Instagram because if I wasn't translating or writing things, I would be taking pictures, and I do a lot of that.
On OnlyFans? Is that like an OnlyFans thing? Or is
I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, good. That's excellent. Good place to end. I highly recommend Alex's social media too. Patrick, any closing words?
Closing words is thanks to everyone who listens to our show, who supports our show, and we'll be back next week with a new one. Thanks for listening.
See you next time.
Bye. Bing, 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 bing.